This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 589, recorded on February 27th, 2020. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today in Bethesda, Maryland, Rich Condit.
Hi there, Vincent. How are you?
Now, people may be wondering why we're in Bethesda. We're sitting in a hotel room. You're across the room. I'm here. What is going on? Well, Rich and I have come here to record 3 different TWiVs with 3 virology giants. Is that fair description?
Yeah, I would say it's a fair description.
You know, we weren't going to release an episode. I was going to release a canned episode, which means it was pre-recorded. And then we realized that things are changing in the coronavirus world, so we should record something for you faithful listeners.
Just for the record, it's 4-ish in the afternoon, and it's 40 degrees outside, and I think mostly sunny.
Yeah, so it's really windy, too.
A little chilly for my liking, but it's okay.
So I came down on the train this morning. Rich has been here a day. We did a TWiV today with Fred Murphy, which is amazing, and you're going to love it.
And which has some relevance to the coronavirus story in places. And then, he's a virus hunter in his own right.
And tomorrow we're going to record one with Bernie Moss and Eugene Koonin.
Right.
But right now we're going to talk about coronaviruses. So let's do that. Now, the situation is changing because there have been now outbreaks larger and larger in different countries. The Chinese outbreak is plateauing. It's tailing off. But we now have 82,555 cases globally. And now we have a lot in South Korea, 1,700. We have 528 in Italy, 245 in Iran, 60 in the U.S. And CDC is thinking that it's going to come here. Remember, the previous 59 U.S. cases were all connected with travelers coming in from infected areas. And we have been remarking that it's amazing that given all the cases in China, it hasn't yet come to the U.S. big time. But now CDC is thinking it will because of these outbreaks in other countries. And then yesterday in California, we had the first case of an individual with no travel history and no contact with a sick individual, which means he or she probably got it from another person who was shedding but not sick.
Yeah, this is, I think this pretty much defines community spread.
That's right.
All right, which is an important concept in this whole thing. When something establishes itself and is spread within a community and is not associated with travel or anything like that, now you're looking at a different situation. And also, when we signed off last week, now what day of the week is it, Vincent?
It's Thursday.
It's Thursday. So it was almost a week ago when we recorded. When we signed off last week, we were kind of musing about whether or not this was really going to be a pandemic. And I was going through the calculation of, given the dynamics of how it arose in China and how long it's been since then, that I figured if it was really going to establish itself globally, it would have done so by now. But now it looks like, yesterday I saw an analysis that said that yesterday, for the first time, there were more new cases outside China than inside China. That's right. And I think that, in my mind, that's kind of a turning point.
Plus, new countries are getting infections now, right? So according to the WHO SITREP from February 27th, 9 new member states reported cases of infection in the past 24 hours. So the virus is spreading outside of China. 3,664 cases outside of China in 46 countries with 57 deaths. So we thought we should talk about this, and we're going to give you our thoughts initially, and then we'll get into some reader questions, which are pretty interesting.
Still, as of man, this old site that we gave, the Johns Hopkins site with all the data on it, is really good.
It's great.
There's also a mobile version of it.
Oh yeah,
that summarize. It's easier to look at on your phone, and I'm on this 2 or 3 times a day. It's really a great site. At any rate, it's important to understand that there's still just at this point in time 60 cases total in the U.S. and no deaths,
of which 59 were travel associated.
Yeah, 59 were travel associated. So
why does the CDC? So a CDC official said yesterday, we are asking the American public to prepare for the expectation that this might be bad. So why are they saying that? What do they know?
Well, I think they know that it has increased in these other places, like South Korea. I think that I don't know how the numbers break down, but my guess is that there's a significant amount of community spread in South Korea, and the same in Italy. And so I think it's proven, the virus has proven to the CDC that it can establish itself in other locations and is on the increase in those other locations. So under those circumstances, and it is in the U.S., there's at least one community-acquired case. So I think under those circumstances, some vigilance of the type that CDC is talking about is prudent.
I'm actually surprised that it's taken this long.
Yeah.
To spread outside of China, because there were for months tens of thousands of cases. Right?
Well, that was the other comparison I was making last week, and I don't have the data, so I can't really make an accurate comparison. But my impression was that the 2009 flu pandemic spread much more quickly than this.
Oh yeah,
I may not be remembering that.
No, you're right. There was an initial case in Mexico, but we didn't hear of it until there were some cases in Texas and Florida, and then all of a sudden, boom. It went off, yeah.
And I don't know what the difference is, whether it's
I don't know
an R0, we don't really know, or the reproductive factor. We haven't talked about that in a long time. It had been rated at one person would on average affect 2 others, but I haven't seen that number updated for a long time. I don't know. A lot of these numbers, we're not going to know what they really are until in retrospect, when this is all over. But there may be other issues of exactly how it's transmitted that makes it, that slows it down relative to flu. I don't know.
Well, what we do know is that in China, it's spread efficiently. So an R0 of 2.5 will spread it. And the other thing is, we now know that there are a lot of mild cases, people who don't seek medical help, and they can transmit infection, and maybe even asymptomatic cases. So something that is spread that way is as Fred Murphy said, it's really hard to stop. Yeah. SARS was easy because you got really sick and you went in the hospital.
Right.
And as Ralph Barrick told us, in SARS, the peak transmission was at the peak of disease. Makes it a lot easier to contain. So this is more like seasonal influenza, but obviously with some differences. Right. But it's still amusing to me, because we have had 15 million cases of seasonal flu in the U.S., 8,000 deaths, yet nobody is scared of that.
Right.
A reporter asked me today, if we had a vaccine against the new coronavirus tomorrow, do you think people would take it? And I said, oh, absolutely. And then next year, no. Just like the flu vaccine. Assuming the virus sticks around, which I think it will, because unlike SARS, it's hard to stop it. Yeah. And there'll always be winter somewhere in the world where it's transmitting. I wanted to reemphasize, now many people are starting to get scared. I'm seeing more and more people with face masks.
Yeah, I was telling you earlier today that I flew out on the plane yesterday, nonstop flight from Austin to Dulles, and I sat down, and a woman sat down next to me, and she looked to be about in her mid-50s, a perfectly healthy individual, and she pulls a little plastic bag out of her purse and offers me a face mask.
How did she say it?
She said, "Would you like a face mask?"
Oh my God.
I declined, and she put one on herself. There was one other guy on the plane in my field of vision who was also wearing a face mask. I was very tempted to have a conversation with her about the coronavirus and the face mask, but I decided to just let it go. I probably shouldn't have. That was a teaching moment, you know. So, but we'll talk about face masks later on.
So I wanted to re-emphasize, for those of you freaking out, 80% of the cases in China have been mild. And a lot of people are saying, well, but the case fatality rate is 2.5%, but that's not right. It's overall 2.5%. But the paper we did last week, remember on the Chinese CDC Weekly, where they analyzed many thousands of cases, it depends on how old you are. From 0 to 49 years of age, the case fatality ratio is 0.4%. And then it goes to 1.3 for 50 to 59, 3.6 for 60 to 69, 8% for 70 to 79. And if you're over 80, 15%. And you and I, Rich, fall in the 60 to 69, 3.6. However, I would say that.
Wait a minute, I'm 70 to 79. I'm up there at 8%. I'm 71 years old, dude.
I didn't know that. I thought you were 60 something. Anyway, these are overestimates because the denominator, the number of cases, I would argue, has been way underestimated. If there's so many mild cases, it could be tenfold underestimated, which would then put the overall rate at 0.2%, which would be like seasonal flu.
Like seasonal flu.
So relax,
right,
people.
We aren't going to have the final answer on this until it's all over. But the case fatality rates that are being reported are an absolutely worst case scenario, and it's related to age and related to comorbidities, right?
Sure, for sure.
So if you're 85 years old and you've got cardiovascular disease, then it's not a great situation under any circumstances, but for catching this thing. You know, even though I'm in the 8% case fatality rate age group, doesn't bother me at all because I'm a picture of health, right?
You're ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
No, you're a picture of health. And you will, so right now, we don't need to do anything because there are no cases that we know of around us. But let's say it's in major cities. Austin has thousands of cases. You're going to exercise prudence, right?
Yeah.
You're going to stay away from people that are clearly sick. And, you know, this transmits over aerosols by a meter or two.
Yeah.
I know it's not so easy to stay away from people, but you probably could stay home more. You're retired, so you can stay home a lot. Wash your hands a lot.
There's a really good New York Times article that came out yesterday or something like that. That's titled "How to Prepare for the Coronavirus," and I thought that this was intelligently written. It's got several subtitles here. One is "Go ahead, move away." Okay,
from another person.
Yeah, somebody else is looking pretty sick. Put 6 feet between you and them because it's respiratory droplets, which means it's not. There's for those new TWiV listeners, you can go back to a gaggle of episodes several years ago. This was this during the transmission experiments?
That was one of them, yeah.
And where we had a big discussion about the difference between airborne
yes.
and aerosol, right?
That's right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So this thing doesn't travel great distances in the air. It's in respiratory droplets. So if you're a couple of feet away from somebody, then their breathing isn't going to cause you a problem.
So you're 2
now.
meters away from me.
Yeah. So if you're sick, I'm okay. Yeah.
But if you put your fingers in your nose and then I shake your hands and then touch my face, which we all do, that could be a nice way to transmit.
Right. We are having this discussion today. It's probably not a good idea to play cards with somebody who's sick.
And we were in a home for older people this morning, and there were a lot of people playing cards.
Sitting around playing cards.
Yeah. So
anyway, one of these is go ahead, move away. The other that we've hyped a lot is wash your hands.
For sure.
Here's how, and there's a video on how to really wash your hands. You don't just stick your fingers under the water, dude. You actually wash your hands. The other one is germ management. This is just a lot of common sense stuff about sneeze into your elbow and et cetera. And then if an outbreak occurs, what should you do? They have a discussion of face masks. Face masks aren't going to do you any good, really, under most circumstances, okay? The flimsy surgical face masks that people use, if you are sick, okay, then a face mask may reduce the probability that you will transmit disease to other people. But if you're wearing one of these regular old face masks, it's under the circumstances not going to really protect you from anything that's going around. In particular, if you're taking it off and eating peanuts all
like
all
the lady
the time,
on the flight.
Like the lady on the flight.
Well, should we all go out and buy $4,000 BSL-4 suits?
No. Just follow just common sense germ control. Sneeze into your elbow. Wash your hands. They say have a supply of food staples and medications, essential household supplies. Bookmark the website of your local health department. Contact your child's school, see what their plan is. And this I see more and more, get a flu vaccination if you haven't done so already, because infection with another virus may compromise your immunity and make you more susceptible to flu or secondary bacterial infections, etc. So this is a really good article. Wash your hands.
All right. Now the CDC is saying for people to stock up 2 weeks worth of food. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
You know what? The logic there is that you shouldn't go out and interact with people, right?
Yeah, but man,
I don't know how people have to go to work, right?
Yeah.
And we're not going to have the travel restrictions that they had in China. In
No.
the last few TWiVs, we've had letters from people living there, and you've heard about them. You can't leave your apartment without a temperature check. But here, the living is different. Many people live in houses, so you can't do that.
Seems to me that the most important thing is that if you are sick, stay home.
For sure.
You know?
Yeah.
I think you kind of have almost like herd immunity and vaccination. I think you almost have a responsibility to your community if you're sick to stay home. And then I think the people who you are home with have a certain responsibility to be vigilant about their own health and their interaction with you. Of course, this gets into a tough area because for some people, staying home is not an easy option. You know, they have to go to work or they'll lose their job.
Sure.
Okay, so that's going to be tough.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see what develops, but it may be that schools close at some point if there are enough cases because kids transmit this and bring it home and so forth. One of the things I wanted to bring up is that the U.S. government has not really responded to this, in my opinion, adequately. Both the president and National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow have downplayed the seriousness. Kudlow said, the U.S. containment of the virus is pretty close to airtight. I would never use that word airtight when it comes to a virus. Up until yesterday, there was no official in charge. And I just wanted to point out that in 2018, the president fired the pandemic response chain of command that Obama had set up to address the Ebola outbreak. So that means there's no bureaucracy to coordinate the federal agencies and local responses. This fall, he shut down PREDICT, which was a federal program to track and research pandemics. I would say we're less prepared than we ever have been. Now, yesterday, he appointed Pence as the coronavirus czar, and I would say, and I'm not getting political, I'm looking at this from a scientific viewpoint, that's the worst person you could probably put in charge. He has publicly stated he doesn't believe in science. While he was governor of Indiana, they had the worst HIV outbreak in the state's history because he had ignored the advice of state and federal health officials. He denied smoking kills. He spread disinformation about condoms. He's called global warming a myth. And if you heard the press conference the other day when Trump was announcing this, Trump started out by saying, well, we have 15 ongoing cases and soon it'll be 12 and then it'll be 0 and we're not going to have a problem. And then a PHS official got up and said, you better put your pandemic plans into action.
Right.
was such a contrast. So I think this is terrible that we don't have a good response in place. Now, we're saying, you and I are saying, and people could call us out on this, you're saying it's not going to be serious. We don't know. We're hoping it's not, and we're suggesting ways you can behave. But if it is serious, we're not prepared. And the money that they decided to give is not enough.
Actually, I wanted to add on for people looking for guidance, add on to the preparation. Well, they say in this New York Times article, they say stay informed. And I want to point out that both the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization are trustworthy and informative sites on this.
For sure.
And those are set up now. And we can put these links in the show notes. But those are set up now so that if you just go to their homepage, CDC or the World Health Organization, you'll find links right there to the coronavirus epidemic and all sorts of nested pages with guidance on what you should do, travel plans, and et cetera. So those are reliable, trustworthy sites. And I would say also to be really careful with social media. I said last week that I think one of the most important things that we do on TWiV is to hopefully teach by example critical thinking. And I think it's very important to learn to apply everything that you've learned about critical thinking to your time that you spend on social media and work to dissect the misinformation from the good information.
Good advice. I wanted to make a few comments about diagnostic tests. If you go to this week's or today's SITREP report from WHO, they say the diagnostic landscape of the outbreak is changing quickly. You know, the first cases were detected by genomic sequencing. Now we're using RT-PCR. As the international caseload increases, there's a need to scale up diagnostic capacity. So WHO is participating in it, helping that to be done. They developed a network of 15 reference laboratories to support national labs, and those reference labs have expertise in the detection. They're helping strengthen national capacity for detection, for shipping tests, and they're helping to ensure ongoing test availability. They've procured a commercial assay that works. They've shipped it to over 150 laboratories globally, and they're trying to strengthen the diagnostic capability. So I think that's all very important. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of people are worried about the diagnostics, and we heard some information out of China which suggested that there was a problem there, but WHO is on it. Now, we have some questions here, which I thought we would address. And let's start with Chia Wei. Do you have that on your computer? Chia Wei?
Yeah. Did you want to talk about this paper about multiple shedding routes?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Now, where did I get that from? Let me see. There are a couple of things that come up here. All right. So first of all, yes. So there's a paper in Emerging Microbes and Infection, and the authors are from the Wuhan coronavirus lab. It's called Molecular and Serological Investigation of 2019 New Coronavirus Infected Patients and Implication of Multiple Shedding Routes. And basically what they show here is they've taken some of these patients from the beginning of the epidemic in China, and there's clearly respiratory shedding, but they also find fecal shedding. They do some anal swabs, and they're positive later in infection. And they say that the anal swabs are more positive than the oral swabs in a later stage of infection. So this is actually something we brought up before. We said that for SARS coronavirus, there was good evidence for intestinal replication and shedding. And these are, of course, bat viruses that have spilled over. So these are bat viruses where the viruses are replicating in the bat intestine. So it's not surprising to me that this particular coronavirus is being fecally shed. But that's a whole nother mode of transmission, right? It's not going to happen with me talking to you. Although with this virus, apparently both aerosol, touching, and fecal oral contamination.
I do want to point out with this paper that it's all done with PCR.
It's all PCR.
Okay.
That's right.
But I wouldn't, even though we often say, well, it's PCR, it's not virus, I wouldn't surprise me a bit if this represents virus.
There was, for the SARS cases, they did look for virus. And they found virus.
So it would not be surprising at all.
But, how do you stop fecal-oral transmission, Rich?
Wash your hands.
There you go. Wash your hands. And especially young kids, although none of them seem to be dying, but they'll still transmit it. So if you hear more about this, at the moment, we don't know what percent of transmission occurs by fecal-oral, right? It's fair to say. No. We have no idea. All we know is it's transmitted by aerosols, contact.
We have the anecdotal situation of the residents in China where there was apparently transmission through the plumbing, and then we have these observations of RNA in the feces. Okay, but we don't. And I don't even know if with the other coronaviruses, we know what percentage of transmission might have been fecal oral. But I think it's just, it's both interesting and important to be aware of that possibility.
So, in SARS, there was that transmission in the apartment in Hong Kong, which was by the plumbing.
That's right. Okay.
I think that's the best example. I think that most of the shedding was, most of the transmission was respiratory and contact. So
I want to go back to the testing for just a minute because CDC has a test as well. There apparently was a problem with this, of them sending out a flawed test, but I think that's been corrected. What I have, the most up-to-date stuff I have on their website says that they have an RT-PCR test and they've shipped it out to, it's not yet FDA approved, but they can do this on a conditional basis, and they've shipped it out to numerous authorized laboratories throughout the U.S., and I'm sure all of this is going to be ramped up over time. So testing is available.
All right, Chia Wei writes, hello, Twivers. I'm going to make a quick comment on Kathy's questions about personal protective equipment. She mentioned there are huge Chinese characters in front of the doc's PPE and wondering what they are. And this was a picture someone had sent us, remember? Those are just doctors, nurses' names. Since PPE needs to be stripped after each use, it's the easiest way to identify the individual. When I was working in West Africa for Ebola trials, we did the same thing, writing the last name with a marker on PPE. On top of that, we write the time they enter the isolation unit so we can track how many hours they work inside the unit. I also saw pictures from Wuhan with dozens of healthcare workers sleeping on the floor or foldable chairs in their PPE. This is an extremely poor practice to use the PPE. It might be a combination of staff shortage and supply shortage. Healthcare workers are simply not protected at that point. Thank you for the great episodes. I'm always excited every Monday to listen to new ones on my 1-hour commute. Thank you.
That's great. That's from someone who says, when I was working in West Africa for Ebola trials, boots on the ground. So
PPE, the whole body PPE with a face mask, with a respirator, maybe in some cases, and whole body covering.
Gloves, boots.
When you take it off, there's a procedure so you don't contaminate yourself, right? Same thing with a face mask. If you take it off to eat peanuts, the outside, which is contaminated, is sitting on your chest then.
Right.
No good. Anyway, these people, I don't know if you remember this in Dallas when the first Ebola case was imported from Liberia, the nurses were not taking off the PPE properly, and some of them got infected. So thank you for that, with the names on the front. Why don't you take the next one?
Li Ping writes, Dear This Week in Virology, thank you for answering my questions on COVID-19. 2 more, if you don't mind. First, there are dozens of videos showing men in their prime fainting, dropping to the ground face down. Some of the videos might be fake, sure, but based on the fact that the videos were taken all over the country, it is likely to be a genuine clinical manifestation of this disease. I'm guessing the fainting is due to lack of oxygen. The pathology paper published on Lancet only dissected tissue from the lung, heart, and kidney. Is it possible that this virus can attack the central nerve system as well? I'll do the second question. We can come back to them. 2, I am an automation engineer, and I spend a lot of time thinking about dynamic balance. This disease looks like an overshot of the immune system to my untrained eye. Can we train our immune system such that it can hit the Goldilocks spot to all the invading pathogens, even the emerging ones? Much like I would train a machine to balance itself under various conditions. Just try to chip in as an engineer. I've been, let me
got
see.
some more questions here.
More questions. Let's do those two first.
All right.
People fainting. I haven't seen the videos. I can't really speak to that, except that, I mean, my first reaction to that is that I'm sure that at some point in the disease, if you're really sick, you're just so wiped out that you pass out. I wouldn't necessarily say it's due to a lack of oxygen or any particular tissue. But
well, remember some of the later developments in this one, Ralph talked about acute respiratory distress.
Okay.
So that's a SARS thing, and it's a symptom of this infection as well. So it could be.
Okay. That makes sense.
I mean, it coupled with, if these people are smokers, right, it could be on top of smoking, which already compromises respiratory function. I don't know, Rich, I tend to not trust anything on social media. I just don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
What it means. So I don't really want to comment on it other than some of them could be real, but who knows?
I love this second question. Can we train our immune system such that it hits the Goldilocks spot to all invading pathogens?
Turn yourself into a bat, right?
Well, you can't necessarily do all invading pathogens, but first thing that comes to my mind is for some, you can get vaccinated.
Yeah, that's right.
That's training the immune system.
We don't have a vaccine.
We don't have a vaccine for this one. The only other thing I would say is, dude, exercise, eat well, keep yourself healthy. Okay.
I mean, the idea that the good part of this question is that a component of the disease is largely immunopathogenesis, right? We're making an overexuberant immune reaction, and we know that's a component of influenza and other viral diseases. But we don't have therapies yet to deal with that. And you have to balance it because you're inhibiting the immune response, so you have to probably also include an antiviral at the same time. Otherwise, the virus replicates out of control.
Well, he's insightful here in talking about the Goldilocks spot, right? In that regard, you want an immune response that'll deal with a pathogen, but not overblown. And he's correct that a lot of the pathology that you see is the immune system doing the best it can and causing you a problem. It's
going to be different for every virus, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no one solution fits all, but certainly people are working on this, but it's not going to have an effect right now.
So he continues, I've been reading the latest Lancet papers on the Wuhan coronavirus, and I'd like to, gives a link, says I'd like to pick your brain on the following questions. 1, patients still test positive after discharging and still shed virus. Does that indicate that this virus is similar to hepatitis B virus such that we can be chronically infected by it, whether or not it manifests itself depending on how strong your immune system is? And second, they have found virus in fecal material, and much like SARS in Hong Kong, there have been people who've been infected via bathroom pipeline transmission route. Are there any known good practices to minimize the aerosol in the bathroom system? Well, we've actually talked about both of these, but it's worth going over them again. Last week we talked about this one about a chronic infection. There's no evidence that it establishes the same sort of chronic infection as does hepatitis B, where you can be a carrier. That's a classic chronic infection. You can be a carrier for a long, long time. But I think we don't yet really know how long it might linger or how long you might be infectious. We also talked last week about how this is a numbers game to some extent. As the disease starts to resolve, you may still be shedding virus, but maybe not nearly as much. So that's going to decrease the transmissibility. And yeah, it's going to depend to some extent on your immunity. We also have just said that, yep, there's virus in the fecal material, that possibly wash your hands. Other good practices to minimize the aerosol in the bathroom.
Make sure your trap is functioning.
You make sure your trap.
Make sure the plumbing one case they took the
working.
traps out of the plumbing.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I have to say that I was just in Starbucks today, and the bathroom had one of these hand dryers that was a Dyson blade. I can't use those without thinking about all of the stuff that I'm blowing all over.
You are blowing into your face, right?
I think I'd be better off just leaving with my hands wet.
So he sent a link to a letter from a couple of people at Yale. It's all about protecting healthcare workers from subclinical coronavirus.
Is this the Lancet?
Yeah. And the problem is this is all kind of anecdotal stuff. And the one thing he focused on, our letter writer, he said that patients can shed high amounts of virus and infect others even after recovery from acute illness. I don't know of any good data for that yet, because that's the problem. They just make this conclusion. And so, of course, it depends on how far after the clinical illness. You could imagine you could still be shedding for a while, but less and less. Whether it's enough to transmit, we just don't know. I think we have to treat this as a typical acute infection until we know otherwise.
Right. Mm-hmm. And we really don't know in this case what those numbers are.
Nathan writes, "Dear esteemed TWiV hosts, I look forward to another podcast on all things coronavirus. Query, I've seen news stories on SARS coronavirus reinfection, and I'm puzzled." And he sends a New York Post article. And my first reaction is, I am sorry, this is anecdotal information. And they're quoting a doctor who said it's highly possible to get infected a second time.
A doctor who declines to identify himself.
I just don't believe it, because you shouldn't be able to get reinfected. It depends, of course, how quickly after the first infection you're getting infected. But then you wouldn't be able to distinguish the two, right? So it could be that the patient has a varying clinical case. They may decline and improve and decline, and they may be interpreting it as two infections, and that's not right. Sometimes you can recover a bit and then relapse and so forth. So, and Nathan goes, how do they measure reinfection? Well, that's a good question. We don't know. And
there's nothing in this New York Post article. I read this New York Post article and I got angry as I was reading it. Okay. Because it was not good.
I don't believe any antibody tests are available, and I thought that measuring IgM was the way to determine if one had an active infection. Yes, that's absolutely right. And you distinguish between IgM and IgG for an active versus a recovering situation, and we don't have those yet.
For those who are not up to date on this is a good point. When you make an immune response, an antibody response to something, the antibody types change as your immune response matures. And the first antibody that's made is called IgM. All right. And then that fades out and it's replaced by IgG. And so this is used, you can distinguish among these with laboratory tests. And so that's how quite often it's determined whether you have an active or very recent infection. It's whether or not you've got IgM as opposed to IgG. Good point.
Sunny and cold in Chapel Hill with about an inch of fresh snow. Can you take blame?
Yes. I knew there was something else I wanted to say about this. Back up to the top of the show, we talked about, in preparing for this, be wary of social media. Now, this is social media linking to the New York Post. I'm not all that familiar with the New York Post, but it's not that much better than social media, right?
Well, in New York City, the New York Post and the Daily News are the tabloids.
Okay.
Right? The sensationalist tabloid. Which is not to say that the New York Times is perfect, right, but it is probably less sensational. I would trust their sources a little more.
But, in an article like this where they're talking about a whistleblower and there's no links to primary material,
right,
a lot of publications in the popular press nowadays are pretty good. They're getting better at referencing the primary material that something comes from. And quite often, if you're reading an article, in the Times or something like that, they will name, even if they don't give a link to the primary literature, they'll name the investigator and they'll name the journal it was published in. If you search for that stuff, you can find the article.
Right. That's
and
right.
Even if you don't understand the whole article, you can get some sense of how legitimate that is. If you look at this particular publication, there's nothing like that. And it's one guy who's flapping his arms and raising a fuss.
Yeah, I mean, I realize that in the outbreak situation, you'd like quick answers, right? But we don't have them, and we need to look at some data to address this. I personally I'm very suspicious of this reinfection issue, but I'd be convinced if I saw the data.
Right.
Now, Nathan realizes this. Nathan, I know, is a lawyer who has a science background, and he just wants us to discuss it. But that's what we feel about this, that it's not a very good source.
Okay. Blaine writes, Dear TWiV, I have a question about the development of a vaccine for the new SARS-CoV coronavirus. It is my understanding that at least one vaccine had been developed by the Chinese for the original SARS virus. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Thanks. If this is the case, then would it not be simple to reformulate a new vaccine with antigens from the old virus? The process would presumably be similar to what is done annually with influenza vaccines and not require new clinical trials, but simply would just require the antigen change-up and manufacturing. If this is not the case, then what have we been doing in the last 17 or so years since SARS emerged in Hong Kong? It was only a matter of time before other coronaviruses would emerge and cause panic. Don't forget, MERS coronavirus also popped up. Why would we not have a vaccine ready to go for this inevitable event? Thanks for your responses. All the best, Blaine.
What a great question.
Great question.
All right, first, yes, a Chinese SARS, the original SARS, they did develop vaccines.
Do you know what that vaccine consisted of?
I didn't know. I do not know. I'd have to look it up. But it was never tested because there's no more SARS around. Right. You need to test it, so they shelved it. And so fast forward, you can't just put the new antigens in because it's not a licensed vaccine, and it would have to be tested. However, there are about a dozen companies working on a vaccine for this virus. However, don't expect it earlier than 2 years. All right? It's just going to take time. It's not going to take 6 months. I challenge anyone to get a vaccine licensed in 6 months because phase 1, 2, and 3, and you have to do that. You can't license a vaccine without it because if you do and it hurts people, then you're in big trouble. What have we been doing for the last 17 years? I think that's a great question. And Fred and us discussed it this morning. The problem is we rely on corporations, for-profit corporations, to protect our health with vaccines and antivirals and other medications. And there was no market for a SARS vaccine in the last 17 years because there's no disease. We have to change the way we develop vaccines. And he said, they tried having a government vaccine and it failed a number of years ago. But I think we should have been working on this in the interim. And if it not for SARS, but for some SARS-like viruses circulating in bats. And yeah, I think it's terrible that we're not ready. At least we could have had an antiviral or so, a broadly acting nuke for all coronas.
Right.
You can do that. We don't have anything. Indictment of the funding of research in this country. And it's really a shame. And you know what, folks? If you're scared about this and you're worried, write your representative, write your senator and say, you need to fund research more because this is unacceptable.
Right.
I'm sorry, I just got
that was a good rap, Vincent.
Nancy, I listen avidly to TWiV mainly, and have done for years with great pleasure and enthusiasm. It is the one most immediately accessible to the ignorant. Recently started with TWiV again from the beginning. Dixon and Vince, what great discussions. Thank you very much. Hearing of reports that people who have recovered from the virus and released are turning up with positive test results. What do you make of this? If this is real, do you know what's going on? Apparently these folks are not sick at all. Here in the Laurentians of Quebec, it's -6°C and somewhat overcast. We are awaiting a mighty wallop of snow starting this afternoon, last of the season, possibly. They are released from the hospital and turning up with positive test results. So you're released when you have, I think what they do in China, if you have 2 consecutive negative PCRs. Okay, that's the criteria for release on a nasal swab or something like that. Again, I don't see the data. I don't know.
Right.
You heard this, as Rich said. Be careful of what you hear about on social media. If you have 2 consecutive negative PCRs, that means one of them may have been screwed up, if this is happening, or it's just wrong. And
it reminds me of the one of the letters we read last week was from a clinician,
right,
who talked about how important the sampling techniques are.
Yeah, that's right.
In getting results.
That's right.
You could get false negatives. You could also, as we've already said, I mean, I'm making this up now, but it is a numbers game. Okay. And you could be, have a dribble of virus still that's ultimately not necessarily going to cause a problem, that's caught on some tests and not others. Sure. I don't really know, but those are my thoughts on the topic.
And she says these people are not sick at all. Well, it's an RT-PCR. Maybe what they're measuring is just pieces of nucleic acid, right?
Yep. Ian writes, smoking must make coronavirus worse. The above quote in the last episode reminds me of this fun study. He gives a link to a paper titled Methamphetamine Reduces Influenza A Virus Replication. Free bonus plaque assays. I guess
the idea is what's bad for you can help something else, right?
But I read, so that's amusing, but I read the paper and I wouldn't, they're sticking meth into tissue cultures of influenza and showing that it reduces replication. This is on top of some epidemiologic study that somehow said that meth users, I guess, had the opposite effect at any rate. So
I can understand they wanted to know the basis for that, but what's the use? You can't give people meth for influenza, right?
I was not very engaged.
Oh, by the paper. So see what he says at the end there? I suggest the flu jab is probably better for you than meth.
Yes.
From a chilly Fife, Scotland. Cool. Robert writes, hello, TWiV. I have a friend working as a nurse on the Diamond Princess as part of the Commission Corps health effort. My question is, what do you make of the fact that the virus seems to affect people that get it so differently, with some not even knowing they have it and some having their entire family killed? Do you think the vast majority of it is just people that have some underlying issues? Is it possible there are 2 different strains? Is it genetic? Or in some contexts, are there opportunistic diseases that also spread alongside of the virus? All right. So we know age is a factor, right? So if you're very young, you're good. If you're old, you're not.
There's no evidence that there are multiple strains that are causing.
None whatsoever. We talked about that last time. There's that great website which is putting
talks about
phylogenetic trees. They're remarkably similar. I think that's the way viruses do things. When you infect a big population, a diverse population like humans, where everyone is different, you get different outcomes, right? And we'd like to know why, but we don't know.
And all the things he mentions here are possible. Underlying issues, different genetics, and et cetera. And we've done some of these on TWiV in the past, where people analyze individuals who respond uncharacteristically to an infection and are able to actually put what seems to be a reasonable genetic explanation for it, but could be a variety of things. And so you're going to get different responses in a population to the same virus infection. David writes, hi, enjoy your show. Would be interested to learn your thoughts on antibody-mediated cell entry and coronaviruses, particularly as it might impact the development of vaccines and synthetic hyperimmune globulin as a drug for SARS-CoV. There are several reports of ADE, that is antibody-dependent entry, which will, in answering this, will describe what that is, occurring in coronavirus infection. And he gives links to several publications. Making a synthetic hyperimmune globulin would be straightforward given modern biotech. Make a single chain antibody phagement library displaying B-cell IG repertoire of COVID-19 survivors, pan for high-affinity spike protein binders, reformat as IgGs, and test for in vitro neutralizing activity. Are there ways we might select for antiviral monoclonal antibodies and avoid ADE monoclonal antibodies? Also relevant to vaccine development. Would not want a vaccine to make the virus more virulent by giving it the ability to invade B cells. Also a biology question. Are the other human coronaviruses close enough to SARS-CoV that there may be some antibody cross-reactivity? Could this be a situation like dengue, where exposure to one strain of the virus may increase the severity of another strain? Thank you, David. Okay, so I have not looked closely at this notion of antibody-dependent entry in SARS-CoV. Do you know about this?
So this is a situation where it's really best known in dengue.
Right.
Where there are 4 serotypes. First time you're infected with any serotype, you get mild disease. There's a certain chance you may get more severe disease. You recover, you make antibodies. You get infected with the second serotype, you get worse disease because the antibodies you make do not neutralize. They're a memory from the first infection. They don't neutralize the other serotype, but they facilitate the virus entry into cells where it shouldn't be. That's well documented in people. And as far as I know, the only example for dengue. When Zika emerged, same issues were raised. Is dengue seropositivity going to cause more serious Zika? And there were all kinds of studies in cell cultures and animal models showing you could get antibody-dependent enhancement. However, when a population study was done, which is the only way you can answer the question, there's no ADE in Zika, either from Zika antibodies or dengue antibodies. These papers are all showing in cells or in mice that antibodies can enhance infection, and that's what was done with Zika. But it doesn't mean it's going to be the same in people, and in fact, you'd have to do an epidemiological study to show that, which we won't have for a while. So right now, I am not worried about ADE. So that's one thing. The making monoclonals, tons of people are doing this right now. It's pretty easy to do by getting B cells from survivors and cloning out the IGs, as he said. So that's in progress, but it's going to take a while because they have to be tested. And finally, are other human coronas close enough? Well, SARS is close, but so few people got infected with SARS, it's not going to make any difference.
Right.
The real question is the seasonal coronas that cause common colds. I doubt it. I've been looking to see if there's any we don't know about this virus, of course, it's too early. And I don't see any cross-reactivity with SARS, so I think it's unlikely.
Right. That's
my take on this, David, who's from Ann Arbor, where Kathy Spindler is.
Yep.
Jerry writes, I'm Jerry, the pest control guy from L.A., have followed TWiV since 2012 or so. That's cool.
Yeah.
The podcast has been valuable for our vector control efforts. We work with California Office of Emergency Services and hantavirus control and local equine encephalitis in West Nile. All vector spread, the hantas for mice, right, and the others mosquitoes. I'm currently both concerned and fascinated with the 2019 coronavirus. I've been watching your educational videos to determine the possible mechanisms to limit viral load in this disease. I told my wife in early January that I thought Arbidol, a protease inhibitor, or possibly interferon would be of some efficacy, and we were surprised to see that there were some subsequent studies launched using these treatments. My questions are other antivirals such as fusion inhibitors, integrase inhibitors, I'm getting into areas I don't have much knowledge of, though. Other than ACE2, what other mechanisms can these viruses be inhibited? Also, the fact that children are not really susceptible is interesting and a blessing. Do you think this is just the fact that kids are able to recover quickly? Or is there a mechanism we can exploit? I was under the impression that children have a smaller immune system library in their white blood cells. It's true. Do you think a difference in apoptosis or lack of something possibly be the reason they are not affected? I would like to see some effective tools to limit deaths until a vaccine can be developed. Thank you.
Good thinking.
All good questions.
Yeah, all good questions.
So Arbidol, I looked into this the other day. This is a drug approved in China and Russia for other infections. It's a fusion inhibitor. It's not a protease inhibitor. And I think it's being tested in China, which has the most cases at the moment. Interferon, it could be tested. Protease inhibitors, there are HIV protease inhibitors, ritonavir and another one that are being tested now in China because they had some effect on MERS and SARS. And so, yes, there are other nucleotide analogs that are being tested, and it's all going on. We talked about that last week, right?
Yep.
That there are lots in progress. About the young kids. So
this is a common situation where infection by a given virus causes fewer problems in children than in adults.
Now, children have less developed immune systems, and so that suggests that they're free of immunopathology, right? And as you get older, you have a better immune system, and you have immunopathology. But then, as we get very old, above 60, then your immune system declines. But in some cases, you get more susceptible to disease. So that's not, it's a balancing act, right? So yes, it would be nice to know why children are not affected, but we don't for this particular disease.
I have this
good questions, though.
Discussion with my wife about sort of generally about pathogenesis. She's, why does this virus cause these problems and another human coronavirus does not? You know the sequences of these things. You ought to be able to look at the sequence and tell me why these viruses are different and do something about it.
Right.
And pathogenesis is one of the most, that is how a virus causes disease is one of the most complicated things out there. And you can't just look at a sequence and understand how the virus causes the disease. That's one of the most complex research topics there is.
Just give us more money. We'll figure it out.
All right. Let's see. Sergey writes, I was wondering if you could discuss on your show whether air pollution in China might have an impact on severity of symptoms of COVID-19 and possibly explain why the outbreak is much more severe there compared to parts of the world where the air is less polluted. Thanks for your highly informative show. Keep up the great work. Sergey. Well, that's an interesting idea.
Now, the first thing I'm thinking of here is if it rains and you have a heart attack, does that mean that rain causes a heart attack?
Yes, that's right. There's a positive correlation between drownings and the sale of ice cream cones.
Now, I don't mean to minimize what you're suggesting, but just because there are fewer outbreaks where the air is less polluted doesn't mean much because there's so many other, and first of all, we haven't had many infections in these other locations. But certainly air pollution decreases lung function,
right,
just like smoking does, right? And I think there are many studies that show that air pollution exacerbates respiratory disease because it not only physically damages your lung, but it compromises immune defenses. So it's a good hypothesis and it has to be tested by an appropriately controlled trial, right?
Right. So I'm thinking that I hope we never have enough data to figure this out, because that would mean that we'd need a very significant outbreak in some location where there's not much air pollution. So interesting idea. And I hope we never have the data.
Even in China, you could say, well, let's compare two areas where the pollution is not so bad and where it is. But then you have a lot of other factors. Can confound you have to control for, and you may never be able to. Just geographic location could trash the whole study for reasons we don't understand. All right, so we have one from Jordan where he basically thinks we don't take conspiracy theories or other theories seriously. So I'm just going to read part of it. I've been listening intently to your Corona podcast since the Wuhan outbreak gained traction in the news. While I think the reporting and info on the initial couple you did was appropriate and informative, I was really disappointed in how you're handling more recently. I know that TWiV doesn't traffic in conspiracies, but I feel like your desire to remain non-conspiratorial or something of that nature is preventing you from discussing real possibilities of what's happening on the ground. I don't think a lot of the questions coming out of this virus outbreak are conspiracies as much as a highly possible scenario given past evidence. All right, so he has a couple of things. And the first is that he thinks China is underreporting the death toll. All right, so we said this last week. The only source of data we have is China. So it's the only thing we have to discuss. For us to say we think they're underreporting it would be absurd. We're speculating, and we try not to do that, right?
Right. And from everything I know, there's no real reason to believe that they are underreporting it. They do have a reporting system in place. Okay, now you can distrust that if you want to, but I have no reason to.
He points out when all of a sudden the numbers jumped. And we talked about that because they changed the diagnostic method and they realized it was not a good idea, so they went back.
So they changed it back and the numbers went down.
So there's no question that things could be happening that are not right. I mean, I think mostly it's because they're overwhelmed and they can't handle all the diagnoses. But what can we do except speculate? I don't find that particularly compelling. And then he talks about why don't we think it came out of a lab? And we discussed that last week, right?
There's no evidence that it did.
And the sequence actually tells us it didn't, most likely, right?
And so, and in fact, there's in his opening paragraph, there's a phrase here discussing real possibilities of what's happening on the ground. That's that sort of thinking is the seeds of the conspiracy theories. Well, it could happen, right?
Right.
Yeah, sure. So, well, actually, the escape from a lab, no. In this particular case, the genetic evidence argues so strongly against that. The virus that's circulating, there's really no way somebody could have or would have made that in a laboratory. It makes no sense. Yeah, somebody could make a virus and release it from a laboratory. Yeah, but not this virus. And as we've discussed so many times before, the probability that somebody could, in a laboratory, create a nasty creature that would establish itself is vanishingly small, I think. Nature does a much better job.
I'm sorry that you're disappointed that we didn't. Well, we did talk about the lab possibility of a lab release, and we discussed that we have the China data, and that's what we have. And CDC and WHO are not questioning it. And he gives us some links to videos that he says support the idea that a lot more people dying, but I just don't buy that at all. I'm sorry. There are plenty of websites you can go to, and they'll talk about this conspiracy idea and present weird data, but they don't understand the virology, for sure. They don't understand the epidemiology. That's what you get from here. We try and give you that, right? Let's see. So Glenn sent a link to more information on toilets and spread. I think we've talked about that enough.
Yeah, right? But that's got some this is from the
coronavirus in your toilet.
This is this.
Morning Post.
Yeah, I've gained significant respect for the South China Morning Post. It posts really interesting articles that are well written, and this has terrific pictures in it. Kathy was talking about this last week. We just didn't get to it. It has terrific pictures in it that illustrate the problems with the plumbing in this housing complex that caused apparently the spread of the virus through the
Housing Department policy changes allowed tenants to modify their pipe design in their bathroom, which could have contributed. So, according to the original design of the bathroom, the toilet is in the center of the unit, with all outlets, including the waste pipe and vent pipe, exposed and connected with the bowl. On Tuesday, they found this woman who was infected, blah, blah, blah. They shared the piping system. So what's the bottom line here?
Bottom line is that these people replumbed their toilets because of the changes in the regulation and did things like disconnected the vent pipe.
Oh, yeah, that's it. They disconnected the vent pipe.
And so that makes it so that you can get basically backwash in your toilet.
They have a great picture of it.
Yeah, and they talk about how it all works. It's a great article.
Okay, wash your hands, leave your toilet alone.
Right.
Asal writes, Hi TWiV Pod V1. So, and she says, I addressed you in this letter to rhyme with the ICTV's naming of the newly emerged virus. Here it is unfolded a bit. TWiV podcast in virology, #1 in the world. Hi TWiV Pod V1. That's great.
Great.
Thank you so much. As always, thank you for the great podcast about viruses. And as one of your listeners has put it in a letter, listening to TWiV keeps me young. I am sharing an article published in the New Yorker. It would be great if you get a chance to read it. This is preparing for the next pandemic, right?
Yes, and I read this article, and I personally didn't really like it a whole lot. Mm-hmm. I mean, thank you. I appreciate the interest. But I thought that it had some kind of out there stuff in it. It was not very...
Well, it says basically that we get spillovers from animals, which we know, and we should be doing a better job preparing for these pandemics, which we know, right? It is really a rehash of a lot of the things we've talked about.
So, and he says things in it that are, I'm skeptical of, actually. It's already possible to transmit and print a DNA sequence using the molecular equivalent of 3D printers, a process that could enable scientists almost anywhere to construct vaccines. That's kind of, on the verge of science fiction.
That's the way you do it, right? The time to prepare is now. Well, I agree with that. We should have been preparing.
Okay. David writes, Hi all at TWiV. As a clinical microbiologist, think cross between infectious disease physician, laboratory microbiologist, and infection control. Wow. In the UK, dealing with the ongoing fallout of coronavirus, I wonder if you have come across any information to answer the following questions. How many people are dying from coronavirus, and how many with coronavirus? We know that many of those who supposedly die from viruses actually have secondary infections with other organisms such as strep pneumoniae, Haemophilus influenza, and Staph aureus, or die from other causes whilst also coincidentally having a virus. This would skew data about the deaths specifically from coronavirus pneumonia. If bacteria are a secondary problem here, it is the normal suspects. Is anyone doing work to look at any collateral damage to health from patients either getting less than optimal care for other medical problems whilst clinical staff are fixating on the risk of coronavirus? Or were other areas of the healthcare systems are being distracted by coronavirus? So far in the UK, we have apparently done over 3,000 tests and found 9 cases. Love the podcast. Amazed at your sustained enthusiasm. Great job. Okay. So, I don't actually know the answers to these questions, and I'm not sure if the answers are known. There's just a little digression here. I used to make a big point when I was giving lectures about the difference between whether or not I know something and whether or not it's known. Okay.
That's right.
And how there ought to be an encyclopedia of stuff that's not known so that you can look it up and find out whether it's not known. Impossible, of course.
That'd be a tough one.
And that'd be a tough one. And my definition of an expert is somebody who actually knows whether or not it's known. Okay. So I'm not an expert on this one. And I can't, I don't know if it's known about how many die from coronavirus and how many with coronavirus. But, in flu, if you die from a secondary bacterial infection after flu, that's scored as a flu death, right?
No,
it's not?
It depends. It's usually the thing that kills you.
Oh, is that right?
And that's why diagnosing flu deaths is typically done by excess pneumonia mortality.
Okay.
So you have pneumonia, and then you have pneumonia secondary to influenza. And so they don't write flu on your death certificate.
Okay.
So it's difficult even for flu. And, if you're at the CDC and you died there, they would probably do it. But in most hospitals, they're not going to diagnose it. You may come in, you may have pneumonia. You die, they may or may not do a flu test, right? So it's even for flu, it's difficult to know whether you're dying of influenza. So there can be primary influenza pneumonia or secondary bacterial pneumonia that's killing you, and most places don't distinguish. And I'm sure it's the same here, especially in China, where you have a respiratory disease, you have pneumonia, they come in, you're PCR positive for corona, that's it. And maybe it's not, maybe it's something else, right, as he suggests. And I think it's a good suggestion, but because we don't actually sort it out for flu, I don't think we can sort it out for this one. And there could be other infections as well, and bacterial pneumonia and so forth. So
there's going to be, we've spent a lot of time talking about undercounting or difficulties in counting deaths from the virus. This is another issue.
Yeah,
there can be some miscounting going on.
Yeah. This other point is really interesting, and we're not qualified to address it. It's because, other patients with other illnesses are getting less optimal care because everyone's focused on this. I could imagine that would be a real issue, right? So,
all of these questions make me think about how difficult it must be in healthcare in Wuhan while this is going on. And this is why the preparedness is so important, because this kind of thing coming down big time can really put a stress on the healthcare system.
All right, James writes, so you want to go another 10 minutes or so?
Sure.
We have to go to dinner in a bit, right?
That's right.
It's 5:20.
Oh, that's right. We need to leave about 5:45.
Okay. We'll finish.
We ought to wrap up by 20 of. We ought to be out the door at 5:45.
All right. No problem. A couple more maybe. James writes, Dear Vincent and rest of the Super TWiV Viral Gang, faithful listener to TWiV over 4 years, enjoy your show immensely. I work in an unrelated field. I have a soft spot for virology and bacteriology, most likely because as a 12-year-old, when asked during an interview what career I wanted to pursue, I responded, bacteriologist. I have no idea why I said it. I secured a place in one of the country's finest grammar school, and now I work in marketing, so go figure. But getting on topic, my question revolves around the Corona cruise from hell and the pandemic proportion of cases in the Diamond Princess. I'm guessing this represents the highest concentration of cases in the world, maybe ever outside of a hospital. It seems to be an error. On the TV news here, a virology PhD lecturer has stated a number of times that the decision to quarantine the ship was the right thing to do, but it is not just not currently understood what's gone wrong. However, I believe 2 weeks ago, Vincent made a comment on TWiV questioning the very rationale of the decision to hold everyone on board, citing this could result in a mass concentration of infected folk. Quod erat demonstratum. I told you it was a good school. So why, in your opinion, was the decision taken when the risks of mass infection was so apparent to the experts? What could happen next time? Thanks for a great show. Well, so I found a great press release from Purdue, which says the ship air conditioning systems will not filter out the virus. So you tell people to stay in their rooms, and they're breathing, and the aerosols being sucked into the system. So I guess that could spread it. I don't know why they decided to do it. I have no insight into their thinking, but the idea that you put infected people together on a ship where they really can't get away from each other just seemed crazy. I would have sent them home and said, stay home.
I heard or read an article at one point, and I would have to look back and try and make sure this is accurate, but something about how there is policy in the cruise ship business about what to do if there is an outbreak of some infectious disease on the boat. Because, of course, they deal with this all the time.
Yeah, that's true.
In particular with norovirus. Yeah. And that at least initially, they were following procedure. But in retrospect, doesn't look like.
They don't quarantine you for noro, do they?
No, I don't think so.
I mean, I think they should bring you back home and release you.
I think that's right.
We have a listener from Norway who's a ship officer who knows all about this. I don't know if he's still listening.
That would be great. I'm looking here. It's interesting because that cruise ship occupies its own space on this data site. Have you noticed that?
Yes.
It's other.
Yes.
If you they have all the countries listed, and then with the cases.
You know what else?
And then there's one that's other, and that's the Princess cruise ship.
45 of the 60 cases in the U.S. were just people that came off the ship.
Right. That's right. Okay. We got time for at least one more?
I don't know. This next one is long. Let's see if we can find a shorter one. All right, why don't you do Jim? Then that'll be the last one.
Okay. Jim writes, thank you for your wonderful podcast, which I discovered when searching for more information on coronavirus. Great. I've been interested in viruses for years and read a few books on the subject. Your podcast is approachable and informative for the layperson. That's very good to hear. Here are my questions. News reports that 2 young doctors, aged 28 and 35, have died in China from the coronavirus. This fact runs counter to the prevailing wisdom that this virus is most dangerous for the old and immune compromised. With regards to viral load, is it possible that these fatalities have more to do with the amount of exposure that these doctors would have received, seeing multiple patients early during the epidemic? Also, there are several reports that patients seemingly on the mend have rapidly declined and in some cases died. Is this aspect of morbidity a trait common in other novel zoonotic viruses that have recently crossed species barrier? Finally, it was comforting to hear virus experts express that they are not currently personally worried regarding the current outbreak. Most expert perspective is appreciated regarding relative risk. Certainly let us know if your opinions change. So these are great questions, and I've asked myself the same question about the young doctors. I don't have the answer to it. I too thought that maybe it's a viral load question, but I don't know of any evidence that would say that. I mean, it makes sense, but I don't have a study that would back that up, but it's a good question.
If you look at the China CDC weekly stats that we mentioned at the top, so between 30 and 39 years old, there were 18 deaths out of the 44,000, and between 20 and 29, there were 7. So people die at that age. Not a lot, but the fact that these 2 are healthcare workers is a little suspicious, but I think in the absence of other data, we really can't make any conclusions.
People do die in that age group, for sure. And there can be. They could have just been genetically unlucky or other circumstances we don't know about. I don't know about the reports of patients rapidly declining or patients seemingly on the mend rapidly declined, but I'm guessing that I wouldn't say that that's a common trait of novel zoonotic viruses.
No.
But I think, it's probably a not uncommon situation, just clinically in general.
As we said earlier, if these clinical courses can vary. You can apparently recover. I know for polio and enteroviruses, you can have an initial period of disease recover, and then you get paralyzed a few days later, right? And that's not a zoonotic infection. So some patterns, the pattern of a virus infection is not always the same.
I wonder, Vincent, if either you or I will get to experience this thing firsthand.
Yeah, I've thought of that, actually. I've thought of experiencing it and talking about it, and I've thought of dying of it, and you guys are going to have to talk about it afterwards. And I thought that would be incredibly, I'm lacking a word here, if I died of the viruses that I loved, right? So much. Yes, I have. I just don't know. We could speculate. So what have you thought about? You obviously have.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've thought that there's not a zero possibility, depending on where this goes, that I'll get it. And I figured that I would probably get something that felt like a bad case of flu at worst, and that it would be interesting.
Yeah, well, I hope we don't. I hope many people do not get it. But if we do and we're able to talk about it, you know what I thought today? I was on a train thinking, could I whip up a PCR in the lab really quickly to diagnose myself so I don't have to go somewhere? I mean, if I did get infected, I would stay home and maybe give Amy a nasopharyngeal swab and say, here, go design some primers. I mean, we could do it. It's easy enough to do, right? Well, no, I'm not sure I could put the swab all the way in the back of my throat, right?
Okay.
Let me just read Johan's. Actually, we only have one left that we didn't read. But Johan is interesting because it may help people. He writes, I follow your podcast regularly. Since nowadays sequencing and peptide synthesis is extremely cheap, I want to see if free and open source vaccine design can become a thing. I was wondering if you may know other open source enthusiasts who are well versed in immunology that may want to contribute. The vaccine design is basically a list of peptides that should elicit an immune response in persons of a matching HLA type. Open source means that nobody can patent the chosen sequences of peptides and anyone is free to make it. I started with a page of some of my preliminary work on this already. I'm not sure whether to paste the link since that may get blocked, but I created a page for it on github.com, and we'll put the link in the show notes. So it's like open source immunogen design. I think that's a great idea.
Great idea.
Because he wrote me and said, is this a good idea? I said, well, let's put it out there and let people respond, and we'll put the link up there. All right. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of coronavirus. And
I'm glad we got through almost all the emails.
Almost all of them. We addressed a lot of the issues. And if things change dramatically, and it's our current plan not to record next week, we'll release maybe the Fred Murphy episode, which is interesting. If things change dramatically, maybe we will do something. I'm going to be in Ohio for Thursday and Friday, so we'll have to be something.
We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. And the good thing about us on TWiV is we're pretty flexible.
I'm certainly flexible.
All right, you can find the show notes at microbe.tv/TWiV. Send us your questions and comments to twiv@microbe.tv. If you like what we do, consider supporting us, microbe.tv/contribute. Rich Condit's an emeritus professor at the University of Florida, Gainesville, currently residing in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Rich.
You're quite welcome. It's always a good time.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. I want to thank ASV and ASM for their support of TWiV and Ronald Jenkins for the music. This episode of TWiV was recorded, edited, and posted by me, Vincent Racaniello. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.